warming has become less about science than opportunism. Soon after scientists rang alarm bells on carbon emissions, everyone from financial institutions to developing nations realized that they could get rich off of it. So while scientists continue to debate the best course of action, those with vested interests declare that the science is settled and offer solutions that conveniently would also make them rich. But we can't allow the need for action to make us victims of self-serving proposals against American interests. Efforts to weaken intellectual property rights at the ongoing UN climate change negotiations are a perfect example. Developing countries like China and India see climate change as an opportunity to gain free access to American IPR. But far from mitigating climate change, relaxation of IPR would ruin ours and the world's only hope of responding in a long-term way. China, along with other developing nations in the so-called Group of 77, wants the UN to establish a, quote, executive body of technology that would be governed by many of these same countries. The Chinese and others propose that this body would determine, quote, technology-related financial requirements, unquote, and seek to ensure that privately owned technologies are available despite the intellectual property protections. Put simply, China and the developing nations seek to transfer the developed world's clean energy technologies to an unelected UN body which they would control. The current draft UN negotiating text that will be considered in Bonn early next month includes proposals that would, quote, exclude from patenting in developing countries environmentally sound technologies to adapt to or mitigate climate change, unquote. Require, quote, compulsory licensing for environmentally safe and sound technologies, unquote, and to ensure, quote, access to intellectual property protected technologies and associated know-how to developing countries on non-exclusive, royalty-free terms, unquote. These governments argue that the risk of climate change justify free access to technologies to help mitigate it. The result would be a transfer of billions of dollars worth of the latest technologies. But the argument mistakes or willfully ignores the truth that technology is not a natural resource that can be pulled from the ground. New technologies will exist only if there are incentives to create them, and innovators should know that if they invest their time and money, their innovations will be protected, not given away. Chairman Markey and I respectfully disagree on how best to respond to climate change, but I think we agree that advanced technologies will ultimately be the long-term solution. Whether we adopt new taxes or a more economic approach, which I advocate, companies won't invest in new technologies unless we have strong IPR to protect them, and that IPR is enforced. As Steve Flutter, the head of the Electro-Imagination Division of General Electric, told the New York Times, why would anybody invest in anything that they would just have to give away? China and India in particular have a checkered history of protecting IPR. The U.S. Trade Representative reported to Congress in April that neither China nor India provide an adequate level of IPR protection or enforcement or market access for persons relying on intellectual property protections, and placed both on its priority watch list of the worst offenders. The Trade Representative's report said overall piracy and counterfeiting levels in China remained unacceptably high in 2008, and that its IPR enforcement regime remains largely ineffective and non-deterrent, while piracy and counterfeiting, including pharmaceuticals, remain a serious problem in India, and its IPR enforcement regime remains weak. Rather than demanding free access to new technologies, if developing countries want to mitigate China's climate change, they should pledge to protect them so that the investments will be made to develop those new technologies. As the world works toward a new international agreement on climate change, I urge the Obama administration to end hopes that IPR will be freely granted by proposing new language for a climate change treaty that strengthens intellectual property and promises to protect and encourage technological innovation. And I thank the Chair. My opening statement, I refer to the current UN negotiating text at the Bonn meeting next month, including proposals to, quote, exclude from patenting in developing countries environmentally sound technologies to adapt to or mitigate climate change. Second, to require, quote, compulsory licensing for environmentally safe and sound technologies. Third, to ensure, quote, access to intellectual property, protected technologies, and associated know-how to developing countries on non-exclusive royalty-free terms. Now, obviously, this goes directly opposite to what everybody said here. What would be your recommendation to Mr. Stern and the U.S. negotiating team when they go to Bonn next month on how to deal with this issue, aside from saying that what's in the text is a non-starter? And I open it up to anybody who wishes to take a crack at it first, but I'm going to ask the other members of the panel to amplify after whoever is the leadoff hitter. Mr. Nelson.
I'll take a shot. I do think you have to have an alternative other than just saying no. One of the things I was looking at as a model is something like the Asian Development Bank, some possible private or private-public sector incentive system, essentially. So for a developing country, if there's a breakthrough technology, that there's some way, it may be modeled off the Green Bank here, that would incentivize primarily U.S. breakthrough technologies to go to developing countries, and possibly loan guarantees or some other way that kind of entices me, instead of going to another developed country to deploy my technology, to deploy in developing countries, still with IPR protection. So I think that, with the overarching goal being that the technologies are still proprietary and protected, but there's incentives to deploy versus disincentives. Personally, I think that it's going to be very hard because of the amount of dollars that are going to be invested in these technologies to deploy, billions and billions. If there's not some kind of intellectual property rights there, then people won't do the investment in the developing countries. So we'll have exactly the opposite effect that the developing countries are thinking it will have. So some incentive structure.
And Mr. Nelson, I appreciate that. The message that I got out of our recent trip to China is either, quote, give us a compulsory license, or if you won't do that, we'll just steal the technology anyhow. Now, either alternative, one which is legal and one which is not, would mean that the actual manufacture of the technologies that were developed as a result of American innovation would not be made by American workers for use in third world countries. How do we solve that problem? Because I think we want to develop jobs here in this industry, and with either the compulsory license or else attitude that we heard in China, we'll be developing the technologies, but the Chinese will be using their workers and paying them slave labor wages, so they'll end up monopolizing the market.
I think we can do both. So I think there's plenty of incentives that are being created here at home to be able to deploy green technologies. And I actually think that, again, the Green Bank is one way of kind of getting some incentives for things to stay here. So at least with this oil, we're gonna start in Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico and other places, but it isn't necessarily a loss for us if China makes this oil under the right construct, right? If China is making domestic oil, that means they're probably interfering in less things outside of China, in Africa and other places. So it might not be a bad thing. I personally think with China is a different case than some of the other developing countries. So I think it really needs to be dealt with at a high level, probably in some kind of an SED construct or some specific government-to-government relationships where IPR is really addressed at an extremely high level. I mean, at least from when we're making our business decisions about China right now, we're waiting, and we're waiting for government help And we're waiting probably to try to get China to invest some of their own foreign reserve in things like this so that they feel invested and that we feel protected.
Well, that's a big problem, because if they can get it free, why would they invest their money in that rather than something else? I think I've made my point, so my time is up, so thank you, Mr. Chairman.